All right, everybody. So, believe we have all of our usual players here. So, everyone's, I believe, for the most part, familiar with the Golondrinas Placita. I can tell you what we do know. We talk about this a lot in our volunteer training. Is that what we do know is that this building was here whenever the property was turned into a museum. We have photographs of this building. We know that it was being used as a barn at the time. And we know that there's this rock surface that goes all the way across the front, and then it has the peaked roof. And at some point, of course, you know, it was a flat roof, and the peaked roof was put on. I can tell you that those rafters just lay on top of the parapet, which is very typical. And the rafters that are in there are fairly modern lumber, early 1900s most likely. And we also see this peaked roof show up in photographs from the 1930s that are being taken from the Pino house over this way as well. We have done some dendro dating on the vigas that are in here. And that dendro dating is really doesn't align with what we understand to be the history of the property. A lot of the dendro dating that's coming out of these vigas is early 1900s. So it could mean a number of things. The most likely, and I should point out that the dendro dating was done by Tom Wines, who's the dendro guy, right? He did all the dendro dating in Chaco and everything else.
And for some of our projects as well.
Exactly, right.
Cornerstones.
Exactly. And what was really common was to replace vigas, to repair vigas. And I can tell you, Tom, he feels like that information is pretty inconclusive. He's continuing to do investigations on this particular building. There is wood that's in the walls. What's typical of this kind of adobe construction is it's not just adobe floor to ceiling. There's a series of correct me, give me the correct term.
Lintels, I don't know.
Exactly, lintels or whatever that are in there to help give strength to the wall. So he's looking at pulling dendro dates from that, tree ring dates. He also believes this rock wall on this side is solid all the way through. This side is a veneer, almost to even out the two sides. And this rock wall continues on the other side of the building. So most likely this was originally a small one-room rock house building that was then built onto over the years. Most likely a dwelling, and then eventually turning into a barn. And that is what we know about this. You know, what came out from the sides is not entirely clear. We don't have really great photographic evidence of that, but one of the things that we've talked about over the years is, wouldn't it be great to do some excavations right up against the foundations all the way around here to see what we come up with? That's something that we hope to talk to Dr. Heather Trigg about in the future, who's looking at doing some investigations here on site. But it'd be nice to be able to see what's happening out here. We do know that there was some inspiration taken from Martinez Hacienda when the Palajemos were developing this complex right here. So there's a series of buildings that were original. How much of it was here, how much of it is creative interpretation and inspiration, that's something that we're looking to kind of connect the dots on as we move forward. And archaeology is one of the tools that we can use to figure that out. Yes, sir.
So, Tom Wine said it was 1900, turn of the century.
Early 1900s, yeah.
Did he have an earth roof?
I'm sorry?
Did he have an earth roof in the 1900s?
Yeah, so that we don't know. Right now, it's all a wood plank roof since it's been covered.
So you don't know if when they date back to the early 1900s?
Yes.
Did it have an earth roof at that specific time?
Well, we don't know, but it's interesting you bring that up. So if you're going to throw a peaked roof on here, turn it into a hay loft so you can throw hay down to your cows that are in the barn, wouldn't you pull the dirt roof off, put in wood plank, right, to put all the hay on, and then you can cut your hay bale loft throw down into? That's one. I don't know. I mean, or was this abandoned at one point and it was reimagined as a barn? I don't know.
If it was flat roof, you needed to have an earth roof.
Yeah.
I mean, there was like no other way.
Yeah.
Unless No, there was no other material, I don't think, flat, you know.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
and that's why I think the pitch eventually comes in. So,
Yeah.
so what I'm saying is that if we actually had an earth roof in the 1900s, yes, that it probably, you know, or didn't have an earth roof, the earth roof was removed, everything was removed, and the vigas were replaced because they were probably too rotted.
Right.
Yeah, around the same time.
Yeah.
So it happened to us when Tom Wines did the one in Isleta for us, the Isleta mission.
Okay.
All the vigas came in around mid 1800s. That meant that the roof was replaced in the mid 1800s.
Right.
So, and which kind of puzzled us, but you know,
Sure.
it could have happened. And
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and that's all part of the life of a building and repairs that are done and how it happens. So
yes.
a lot of questions. You know, as was said, the more we know, the more questions we
More
have.
questions than answers.
Exactly.
This place was reconstructed in the late 60s, early 70s. And there's people here, right here in the valley, that could answer questions. In conjunction with the archaeology we want to do, we could do an oral history program and ask some of the old timers here, you know, what, did you actually build the walls on top of original walls, or was there poetic license involved? So there's going to be a great project over the next few years to really confirm how much of what we're seeing right now is built on an original floor plan and how much isn't. So thanks for bringing that up.
Your volunteers really need to know that.
And another thing that I feel that, because I don't know how many years this plaster has been on, it would be great to actually remove some of the plaster to look at the adobe that is behind it and look at the dimensions of it, and then and to see if one, you know, was reddish and the other one was more brownish, you know, and that could actually tell us, you know, tell you guys, you know, quite a lot of information.
Sure. Yeah.
So.
No, seriously, the well.
The well. So, and I might have to defer, say, to Sean or to Mike a little bit more about the well. I just know that the well recreation has always been here since the museum was done. I have seen photographs. It's Dr. Melzer has gathered some photographs of both latrines in New Mexico and wells in New Mexico. So I have seen this photograph, certainly a little bit later, but I think it would really be great to look at an excavation out here to see if there was ever evidence of a well, or is this here to depict what a well may have looked like. I can tell you that at the Martinez Hacienda, it looks a little bit more like a cistern where it's kind of over in a corner and it's an open pit where you might dip for water, as opposed to a well like this. But yeah, again, another great question. If someone would only pick up the research on the wells of the Southwest, that would be great. That would be great.
Where's our food?
All right, so the vaca placita. I'm gonna have to speak over the ladies, the sheep. So the vaca placita. So a couple of interesting things that are happening here. So the Baca house behind me, dendro dates here are coming out at 1820, 1830, which falls right in line with what we've always thought we knew about the area based on oral histories. Again, this house is based on those early oral histories. This over here that we were just talking about in the Golondrinas Placita is based on oral histories, but it's also based on early research that was done by Myra Ellen Jenkins. Some of that research was correct. Some of it was close to the target, and that we've been able to pinpoint a little bit better through the work of people like Malcolm Ebright and everybody else who was talking today, to get a better idea of who was here. And I'll go over some of those family names tomorrow, the same names that I go over during our volunteer training when we talk about who we know is here, to give everybody an idea of the life that was happening at Las Golondrinas. So the Baca house here, what we know about this house is that it was in great disrepair. when the Palahemos first purchased the property, and whenever they began looking at reconstructing it, part of the roof had fallen in and some repairs had to be done. John Galmim saw the building as well, but we do know that it was at least an L shape. So there was a wing that came out from this window right here, well out into the middle of what's now the placita. So something that we would, and it's also interesting to see, look at what's the level difference. You know, this is almost sort of up on a plinth, and we know something was coming out this way. So it would really be great to get in here and maybe do some kind of a remote sensing or whatever to see if something's happening with foundations. Hopefully, whenever this placita was created, everything wasn't completely destroyed, and there's some kind of evidence that'll give us an idea of what's happening. But at least we know it looks like some of the original vigas were still in the house. And of course, this house isn't entirely built from adobes; it's built from terrones, which is turf. So they had cut turf like you would in Ireland, because we're in a marsh, and you would cut turf and lay it out to dry, and then you would build your house. So we talk a lot about adobe, and we've tried to up our adobe game and our log structure game, but you know, we need to do a little more research in talking about rock houses in New Mexico, terrones in New Mexico. We can probably pull UNM to help us out with some of that interpretation. We have resources who are here today. So that's generally what we know that's going on with this house as well. We do see the different construction techniques with both sides of the houses. Again, I'm basically preaching to the choir here for the most part, but you can see the break in the roof line behind me. Most likely this side was first, one room house, then later this side. And there's a few differences, round vigas versus squared off vigas as well. No window pane glass. This side does have window panes. And if we can pull some more photographs, hopefully from the Acequia Madre collection, that documents any of this if it does exist. But Jordan and her team over there are going through all that material, and that's all old Palahemo curtain family material. So hopefully there's some gems within there. We did do an excavation out in the middle of the placita. For those of you who recall, maybe it was seven or 8 years ago, the movies came out, and it was a Western zombie film, as one does, and they wanted to do what we refer to in the office as zombie emergence. So they had this idea about how they wanted to dig a huge pit, put a pneumatic device in there where they could put an actor, a stunt person, laying down, cover the pit over, and at some point during the scene they come flying out of the pit and attack some poor unsuspecting cowboy, or I don't know, whatever it was about. So we said, well, you can't just come out here and dig a pit, you know, you have to, there's archaeology involved, it's a very sensitive site. So we had OAS, Eric and his team came out here, they actually dug the entire area. And there was a few items that came out of that were of interest, nothing really, it was just one small area. The cultural layer is really maybe that you know, depth-wise. So they blew through that pretty quick to what's called sterile soil, where it looks like there's no other evidence of tampering or anything. But that was about the only excavations that had happened in this area. But I think there's probably a lot of opportunity to kind of see what's going on around the foundations of the Baca house and out into this area, and maybe with some kind of remote sensing, people who are smarter than me, like Dr. Heather Trigg, about how exactly all of that works. But is there any questions about the Baca placita? Yeah.
So this house here, you said it was from the turn of the century, the early 1800s?
Early 1800s, according to Tom Wines and according to the oral histories.
Okay. And which vigas did he do dendrocanal?
He pulled from this side.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, because these are rectangular.
Right, right. Any other questions about Baca placita?
Just one last question.
Oh, yeah. Hilario.
Just a comment, my great-great-grandfather was Miguel Romero y Baca. And his mom was Ignacia Baca, grandmother of Manuel Baca. So we're going back to the 1600s with this family, And I'm beginning to wonder if this is where my great-great-grandfather was born,
Yeah,
in this house.
for sure.
I've wondered that as well,
Did you think about that one, Mike?
Yep, yeah, we need to figure that out.
Yeah.
With
Can't
this
we all
little
decide
help.
amongst ourselves? That's the history going forward. Spread the word.
Because it could be older. You know, if he was
Yeah,
born
who
in this
knows?
house, this house would be older.
Maybe it was just re-roofed in the 1820s. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I can tell you this is that we do know that we don't know enough about what's happening here. So whenever I throw out some of the names of these families that were involved out here, a lot of these names are really kind of the heavy hitters in New Mexico. And we do know that at least some of them also had homes in Santa Fe, also had ranches in other areas. So while we know that some of these people owned this property, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were living in this house or over there or whatever. But there's definitely these clusters of buildings and homes on the site. And tomorrow is going to be more of a hoof, whoever's up for that. So we're comfortable shoes because we're going to trek over across the property and try to look at some stuff over there. But we'll look at one of those foundations and we can talk about some of those clustering of properties. Also over on the La Loma, up over on the residential side of the property as well. And so we're pretty sure that there's something going on here that we don't fully understand and that we don't really know enough about. But over on this back side where you walk down the crazy hill that our volunteers call Heart Attack Hill, lovingly, and the hill that goes down to the road, because this sort of drops off suddenly, we've always had kind of some washout of material along that ridge line. So we knew that something's happening over there. You know, I mean, in some ways, archaeology is digging through people's trash from the past, I guess, in a lot of ways, and it's fascinating. So knowing that people like Kurt Anschutz and David Snow and Marianne Stoller have been involved with excavations and surveys throughout this valley, and so we have an idea of these various sites that are happening here, different time periods from the Archaic period all the way up to through the 1800s. And so we've been working with Dr. Heather Trigg, who's going to be speaking tomorrow, who's here with us today, who's done a lot of work on LA 20,000, a early 1600s Spanish ranch site here in the valley. And we said, Heather, can you help us out, get an idea of what's going on here at the property, pick up on some of this survey work? And so she came out with her team this summer and did a couple of surveys and looked at a couple of different sites. So this is our Toriyon site. This was excavated just before I started here, so maybe it's been 12, 13, 14 years ago, I guess, when it was done. So it had always been known or understood that there was a Toriyon here from the previous owners, and then that information was passed on to the Palajemos, to the Curtins and the Palajemos. We have another Toriyon site that's over across the other side of the property, and then we had this one here, and it was very clear before the excavation had happened that there was something circular happening on the ground. Got in, did the excavation, uncovered the foundations of a Toriyon that's right here in this photograph, and it looked like it was from late 17, early 1800s, as I recall from the report. And then during the life of that particular building, and then we do have an artist recreation of it here and here by Ron Kill, that it didn't just sit there just as a Toriyon. It was a building that people had invested time in, so you're going to use it in some fashion. So they did a pollen analysis, came up with a lot of corn pollen, and so clearly it was being used as storage and as a silo in some way. And then in the mid 1800s was turned into a residence and then that's whenever it appears that there was a door cut into the foundation. So instead of having the door up high, the door had then been cut down in this area, and then a kiva fireplace put over in the corner as well. And they believe that that's the time that the interior was completely whitewashed also, because we did have a section of wall that had fallen over and preserved the whitewash that was done inside. But Toriyons, we understand there was a series of Toriyons that were up and down this valley, probably all built around the same time as a means of, lookout, protection. We have the representation over in the Golondrinas Placita as well. There's another Toriyon that's on a property further down, I believe on the old Gallegos property. This particular Toriyon would be within visual sight of the one that's just beyond, and there was probably more that made its way up across El Alamo and beyond. Some interesting things that were found here were a lot of ceramics from varying periods, a lot of evidence of domestic use, but two really interesting things was this ring right here and this earring. The ring I was familiar with from there's some sites in Florida where the same ring shows up, and there's two really good publications that were done on archaeological material in Florida, southeastern United States, and so this ring shows up there. And so this was a mass-produced copper alloy ring that was being made in Spain with the file design, and then it was being shipped over to the east coast of Mexico and then eventually up to New Mexico. So a pretty interesting story about how this thing might arrive all the way up here on the northern frontier, and then whoops, somebody lost it. It's too bad. The earring was super interesting. This is a tambourine style earring, and that particular style was actually being made in Southeast Asia. So this is an item that came from the galleon trade to the west coast of Mexico and then up here. And then I really feel for the person who lost this earring. I mean, it must have been just an absolutely awful day. But again, it reminds you that while you can be on a frontier in whatever part of the United States, whatever part we're talking about, in this case here in the Southwest, this American story here, and you still have this very fascinating, interesting connection to other parts of the world, this real evidence of global trade. And so really happy that these two items were found and we're able to tell that story. But are there any questions before we walk over? Yes.
So where are those now?
These are in our collections here at Las Golondrinas.
Okay.
Yeah.
They were planted deliberately by the owner so we could find them.
Yeah, exactly.
Any chance that it was military installations, or were they private?
That's a really good question. I personally don't know enough about the history of Toriyons generally in New Mexico. Hilario, if you know and can elaborate.
Yeah, the Toriyones that were built here in Santa Fe, there were so many of them, and they all tried to communicate with each other. It's kind of what the Pueblos did. When they did their multi-stories, usually in the corners, they'd have one room higher than all the rest. And it might not have been circular, or it might have been circular, maybe even squared off. But they were all lookouts to the next lookout, to the next lookout, to the next lookout, because there was intercommunication, constant intercommunication between every community. And so the Toriyones, you notice they have these small windows on the top. And most of them were built of stone. They used stone, preferably, rather than adobe. They were, average height, I think, was anywhere from 12 to 15 feet. And they used whatever, rock was available in the area, and they put it together like a puzzle. Okay, it was really like a puzzle. They used laja, like this, laja sandstone, flat sandstone, laja. or they used fairly thick pieces of sandstone, and then they would piece them together. The top small windows were, of course, where they would, inside the Toriyon, they would build a loft. So you would go up to the loft, and then you could put your musket out, and protect. Not only look out, but it was also a form of protection. And it's true that a lot of the Toriones ended up being people's houses because they were fairly large in circumference. And so, you could actually set up shop there. But most of the time, it was for the weapons. They would store the weapons, they would store the grains, they would store whatever they could away from the house and locked up. But there was always somebody guarding. There was always a guard. So the only military in the area would have been the military patrols that really were guarding the horse herds, because they grazed the horse herds out here. The Presidio horse herds, they all took turns. La Majada, La Bajada Mesa, and then, of course, Agua Fria. All of them, all of the different areas that I explained this morning, they all took their turns at taking care of the Presidio horse herds, because when the military would go out on a campaign, 5 horses, at least 5 horses for each soldier, okay, because you're chasing the enemy, right? So behind you is your chuck wagon. Of course, they weren't called chuck wagons, they were called food wagons or whatever. and they had those in the background, and then they had those that were guarding the horse herd that was coming along with them. And as they would go out and chase the enemy, then they would come back, change horses, and go off again. And it was that constant movement as they moved to track whatever tribe had, attacked the village or attacked the area.
So, and you can see why they would have chosen this location. It's a pretty commanding view south. And this was actually the first project that was handed off to me whenever I first started here as the curator. I can remember Mike King coming to my office saying, "All right, you're the curator now. Here you go. Here's this. This is what we know. How do we make this an interpreted site?" And so I'd done a lot of this work for the Indiana State Museum. So Sean and I collaborated on this, talked about it. Okay, well, let's cut the trail. We already had there used to be grazing area between the 2 ponds where the sheep would come in. Let's cut the trail through there. And then we talked a lot about, well, where are these going to go? And Mike was involved, and the Park Service was involved. And so we had a huge discussion. Do they go here or do they go down there? And there were some of us that were on both sides of that. And I know Mike and I were on the side of placing them right here because it's all about view shed, right, at historic sites. So we're like, look, if you put them up there, you're going to ruin the view shed. You got to be able to stand here. You get the information. You get to be able to imagine yourself back in time. And so I'm really glad that we're able to figure that out, because I think it's a big part of what makes the site so special now in terms of interpretation. And then down there, we just covered over the site with a geotextile fabric, and then we mocked up a foundation, a la National Park Service style kind of thing, so we can give people a sense of scale, where it was placed, and everything else. So, questions before we walk over real quick and get a closer look at it? Okay, let's head over.
So, was it adobe or was it stone?
So our understanding was that the foundation was stone, and then the rest of the Toriyon was adobe.
Oh. Got it.
Yeah, because there was significant adobe melt that was over here, not just from plaster. So this is, Sean and I took great pains to make sure that this was placed exactly where the foundations, the original foundations are, that are located underneath it. Again, you can see the view south. You could imagine there being another Toriyon within view. And if you turn back around this way, you can just barely see straight this way the Toriyon house that's up on the La Loma side, where we believe the other Toriyon was. That would have been in view on that ridge in the distance.